Okay, welcome back everyone. Welcome to exercise 2 for the Vanitas project. And if you're worried that my scene already looks a little bit different to yours, don't be. This is where you're going to end up by the end of the tutorial, but there's a couple of things that I want you to work out for yourself. The reason for that is that, it's pretty common when teaching with tutorials that everybody just copies a tutorial and ends up with the exact same thing. So what I'm going to do as a learning exercise is I'm going to leave out just one or two steps and I'll tell you which ones they are, and I want you to kind of work it out for yourself. The first one is this block of wood. Now we've already, using polygon modeling, taken a cube. We added a cube like this, Shift A, mesh cube, and then we get a giant cube here, which we can scale and make a different size. And we made a book out of that, and we textured the book. I have basically done the exact same thing, but I've made this, nice kind of block of wood, which is going to be the table for our Vanitas. If we take a look at the textures here, you'll notice there's a few extra things. I downloaded a whole texture set from a website called Polygon, which not only gave me the wood here, but Polygon gives you sort of a few different maps that have very, very small details here, if you can see here. And what these are doing is they're telling Blender, in this case the gloss map, what to do when light reflects off it. And see how the light is reflecting off the wood? We can almost see the unevenness in the varnish on the wood. And that's what some of these extra texture maps here are doing. In class, I can show you sort of where to get textures, excuse me, where to get textures like this and where to connect them. And in our tutorial today, we're going to do something which I think is even more interesting. We're going to make our own texture just using internal components from Blender for this skull. And we're also going to look at things like how shiny an object is, and how we can simulate that. Okay, so I'm going to remove a few things from my scene, and we're going to look at where to find objects like this online, but then also how to bring them into your scene and put them with the objects you've already made. And also we'll do some organization to keep our scene looking nice. So I'm just going to delete this skull, and I'll delete these pieces of coral, and I'll just view through my camera by pressing Command 0, or actually let me just turn on Keycaster. So hopefully you should be able to see my keys now. Is that better? I'm having a little trouble with Keycaster recently. Okay. Seems to not be working on top of Blender. Oh well, let's just keep going. Okay, so looking at my scene now, there's a few things we've done. I'm just going to turn off one setting. You'll notice, see how it's a little bit blurry in the background there? It looks a little bit more photographic. That's what's called depth of field. And if I turn that off and you watch this line there, you'll see it'll go from sharp to fuzzy. And that's just simulating how a camera lens works. And we might come back to that at the end of this exercise when we're getting ready to render. But first of all, I'm going to show you how to find some objects online and how to bring them into your scene. Okay, so there's a few websites which I think are really great. First of all, there's TurboSquid. TurboSquid, if we go back here, turbosquid.com, basically if we go to the home page, it'll look something like this, and I can just put in skull and hit search. Now, there's going to be all sorts of really beautiful 3D models, but this is also an online marketplace. So I don't recommend spending money on 3D models when you're just starting out, because you might not know what you want, and I think it's better to work with free things while you're building your skills. So we can just set this price to free and sort by lowest prices, and you should get a range of different 3D models. And what you want to look for is the file type. So see here where it says FBX and OBJ, that's what we want to use. These are two sort of exchangeable 3D file types that work in almost all software. This one is only for 3ds Max. I don't think it has an OBJ option. Here, FBX, that looks fine. It's free. So you might have to sort of make an online account. You guys might find other websites that you want to download things from, but when you find something, you just log in and download your model. The other website, which I think is really great, which you don't need to log into, is actually, just let me go back. Oh yeah, here, the Smithsonian 3D digitization. And this is really cool. The Smithsonian Museum in the United States has been 3D scanning all sorts of artifacts from their collection, and you can download them for free online. And I thought for this Vanitas project, these are absolutely perfect because they're exactly the sort of things that we would find in 16th century still life painting. So if you go into things like this, like into corals, you can actually find all sorts of 3D models, and you can download them and use them in our scenes. So I downloaded one. It wasn't this exact one, but this one's also pretty beautiful. So if you go to view model here, you'll get a live 3D view, but you'll also have the ability to download. And from my checking, the low resolution is absolutely fine. It's more than enough detail. So just download a low resolution 3D mesh, and you should be good to go. Once you've got your meshes downloaded, I also recommend putting them in a folder where we're going to talk about this a lot over the course, where you've got everything organized. So here I've got my project files. I call my 3D models my assets. That's just a naming convention in 3D. And here we've got other things like video files and sort of some other stuff that I accumulate as I teach the course, as well as some previous student projects. So you probably don't need that folder. But we'll go over this a little bit more in a few of the videos. Okay, so let's just return to Blender. And first of all, we're going to import the coral. So if I go File, Import, OBJ is the file that we downloaded. And so this is my assets folder. And I put the assets folder next to my project file. So Blender already starts looking in this directory. I'm going to go into the coral, and I'm going to grab the OBJ file. This other file here, .mtl, that's the material. And if they're in the same folder, Blender should, yes it has, it should bring in the texture automatically, which is really convenient. So if I just look for my orthographic and bring this down into my scene and line it up with the floor, remember I'm pressing G to grab, and I can scale it. Sorry, just give me a little bit of room here. Scale it up a little bit, bring it back up onto the table, and I can even rotate it, R and Z, spin it around a little bit, and that's pretty cool. That's already perfectly sort of suited for the theme of our project and ready to go. And if I'll keep our camera view, and I'll get in a little closer, and I'll go into material preview. We can see that it's detailed enough for our purposes. We're going to be in low light. It's even got some kind of weathering because I've actually just 3D scanned the coral and the original base. So I think this is really cool that we can actually download objects from, famous international museums and start to play with them in worlds that we make of our own. Okay, excuse me. Okay, so now let's bring in the skull. So here we don't need to do any more texturing. That's already absolutely fine. So let's bring in the skull. So File, Import, OBJ, and here's my skull. Now this is a big file because it's a file that I downloaded ages ago. So it takes a little bit longer to import, and we can see that it's also huge. So much like we did when we were getting started, I want to have it kind of skull-sized, So if I just press Scale and make it smaller, I think basically I want the Y-axis to be something like 18 centimeters. That's kind of what my head feels like, 18, 20 centimeters, something like that. Let me just press Shift and middle mouse to get a little closer, have another look. Yeah, 19, that looks kind of about the right size. So as like before, I'll press on the orthographic Y view here, and I'll press G to grab, and I'll just move it so that looks like it's on the floor. Now we can see it's outside of the shot, outside of our camera, so I'll move it across a little bit, and maybe I'll rotate by pressing R and Z and just sort of spin it around a little bit. And then we can also see that it's still not quite touching the ground. So here I might rotate it a little bit on the x-axis, and something like that, and then just pop it on the ground so it kind of looks like it could be sitting there. All right, so we can notice with this skull that it doesn't have a texture. I might just bring it a little bit further, like that. It doesn't have a texture, and at the moment it's just this sort of plain white and doesn't look very realistic at all. The only reason it has that shading is that we turned on some of these render effects here, like ambient occlusion, and that's what's giving it those nice shadows there, but it has no texture. So what we're going to do now is we're going to make a new texture for it, just like we did with the books, but we're going to use internal generators from Blender instead of external textures. And the reason for that is that, you know, it's we don't need a picture. We really need sort of a color and a few other properties to tell Blender what sort of surface this is. So I've made a new material, and I'll call it Skull New, just because there's probably already a skull from one I made earlier. And first of all, obviously what we could do is we could just give it a kind of a bone-ish color, you know, maybe somewhere there, and I could desaturate it a little bit. And yeah, you know, it's okay, but it's not great. It's still too flat. So what I'm going to do is something a little bit different. First of all, I'm going to apply the scale, because remember before we said once we move objects around a bit, it's always a good idea to apply the scale. So Command A and apply scale, or I think we can also go Object, Apply, Scale. Same, and we've got now a scale of 1. So now we're looking in the shading section here. I'm in the shading tab up here. I will press Shift A. The first thing I'm going to add is a noise texture. So some of you who have done any other sort of generative graphics are probably familiar with noise. It's basically a computer-generated pattern that we can use as a base for doing other manipulations. So when I plug in this 3D noise into the color, we get this kind of random rainbow texture. You know, if you were making a, I don't know, a tie-dyed t-shirt, that might be perfect, but for our skull, it looks a little strange. But we can do a few more cool changes. First of all, I'm going to make those patches smaller. I'll make this about 15, maybe turn the roughness up to about 5. Then I'm going to add in Shift A, what's called a color ramp. Color ramp is basically transitioning or interpolating between two colors. And if I hover over here and left click, it will insert that. And you can see what it's done. It's taken the noise texture, the color going into the factor, and now we're ramping between black and white. But if we take this first handle here and click on the black, we can change that back to that kind of bone texture that we had before. Something might be a little bit darker. I'll desaturate it a little bit, maybe make a little bit darker, something there. And then here, we'll do a kind of a lighter bone color again. And now the cool thing with the color ramp is we can sort of adjust this. You know, that's obviously going too far, but you can see what it's doing. It's now we've compressed a lot of this area into a flat color, so that's why we've got those big patches, and then we're still transitioning here a little bit. This would be great also to make a camouflage texture or all sorts of things. But we'll keep that, you know, kind of soft, just so we're getting that sort of uneven texture of a skull. Something like that. Now the next thing we're going to do is we're going to use another color ramp. We'll just leave it on black and white, but this time we're going to use that to, excuse me, to control the roughness. So if I look at the roughness here, actually no, we'll do the specular, sorry. Specular is going to control which bits of the skull are sort of really shiny and which bits are less shiny. I might just get us a little bit closer to the skull and actually pan around it a little. And what we can do, if we go into our rendered mode and see where the light is hitting the skull, if we start to compress these values, we should see that it's changing a little bit how the light is falling on our skull if we compress here. And if we put the same, actually maybe the roughness is better. let's just have a look here. If I just disconnect this. Yeah, okay. Oh no, sorry, I've got the alpha going there. That's why it looks a little strange. Okay, yeah, so that's what we wanted. So if I change here, we're sort of seeing we're making some parts of the skull sort of shiny and some parts of it a little bit smooth. And what that's doing is it's using the same black and white sort of variation from here. But it's, instead of just having it with the color, it's using the same information to tell Blender, I'm just going to hide this little overlay, to tell Blender which parts of the skull are shiny and which parts of the skull are smooth. So when we're in our render, we can sort of play around with that. But you can see as I shift this, look at this area here, when I compress the white, we lose some of that shininess. But when I drag it out, we've got this idea that these bits are just a little bit more shiny. And see, that's obviously too compressed. But somewhere down here, it does sort of feel a bit better. Then we can, I'll just collapse these so we don't have to, so they're a little bit smaller. Then one other thing we can add is what's called a bump. So if I add a bump here, a bump, what that can do is it's a little bit like a normal map. We're going to take some color, black and white color information here, and we'll go into the normal. And then we're going to take the normal and we're going to put that into here. And it might look a little bit crazy at first, probably a little bit too strong. Oh, sorry, I think that should have gone into the height. Let me just check that. Yes, because we're looking at a bump map. Yeah, okay, so let's put this much lower. 0.01, and basically that's simulating, I'll make that a little bit higher, 0.1. It's simulating a kind of a roughness on the surface. And if I put it up a bit higher, you'll see it's getting too rough. But basically it's taking that noisy sort of texture we had here and using it to sort of simulate a noisy sort of or bumpy type of surface, and just making it look a little bit more realistic. I'm just going to save my file as I'm working. Finally, one little touch that I think works, see how the skull looks a little bit chalky, it looks very opaque. There's one other setting that can look a little bit interesting, which is subsurface scattering. If I take this value here and I put in something kind of high, like 0.1, all of a sudden the skull, it kind of looks like it's made of wax because we're scattering the light underneath the surface. If you think about wax or some types of soap, you know, things that are a little bit see-through, what's happening is that as the light hits the object, some of it bounces off the surface, but some of it penetrates in, bounces around, gets scattered, and then bounces out again. It's getting scattered beneath the surface, therefore subsurface scattering. And if we have just a little bit of this, I think it also makes the skull just look a little bit more interesting. If you look on just some of the rims, to me it really starts to look more organic. Whereas if I put this back to 0, something about it just looks a little bit more kind of chalky, like it's made of plaster. So I'm just going to have this 0.0, maybe even 0.02 seems a little bit much. We're starting to get that rainbow effect. Let's go back to 0.01. Okay, so what we've just made there is what's called a procedural texture. So I'm going to go back to my camera and just look at this through my camera. So camera set active object as camera and zoom out a bit. Okay, so now a few more things with lighting. We're going to adjust this a little bit more. So one thing that my scene has at the moment, which yours doesn't have, I'll turn this off, is I've got what's called an environment light. And I'm just, oh, actually, here's a nice way to demonstrate that. One thing I didn't mention with the skull, of course, I'll put my environment light back up. Of course, you know, you can texture if you have a skull object, you can texture it like it's made of bone. But once we start playing around with the shaders, we can kind of make our skulls look quite different. Let's look at this value here, the metallic value. If I change this from 0 to 1, look what happens to our skull. It's taking the exact same colors, this kind of the color ramp here, but now the skull looks completely gold. It's a totally different effect. And if it's a metallic, usually our subsurface would also be 0. Now, if I do something, I'm just going to sort of play around a little bit here. If I do this and turn our roughness down a lot, we'll get a very, very shiny... Actually, no, I'm going to do this on another object. It'll be easier to see. So I'll just put this back up, put our subsurface back to 0.01, and put our metallic back to 0. So we've got our skull back again. And I'm just going to add in a shiny ball, which we will use later anyway. One trick, if I want to add my shiny ball into the center of the scene, I've just turned my viewport overlays back on. I can press Shift and right click, and I'm actually adding this thing called the 3D cursor. And the 3D cursor basically just helps us know where to add stuff into the scene. It's very convenient. We can do lots of other tricks with it, but when it's turned on, when we add a new object, in this case I'm going to add a sphere, it's going to add it right where the 3D cursor is, and if I scale that by S0.1, we can see it's right where I added my my 3D cursor. I'll scale it down a little bit. Just going to bring it up, and I'm going to right click and shade it smooth so it looks like a ball. And I'm just going to very quickly make a metallic object again. I'm going to make it metallic 1 and roughness very low. So now I've got this shiny object. Now, what you'll notice, see that shininess, it's actually reflecting, you can see some trees and stuff there. That's because of this extra lighting thing that I've added in. If I turn that off, the only thing that's reflecting, that the ball is reflecting, is the light that we have in our scene from the first exercise. So in the first exercise, I mentioned that when we have just one light, we often have this problem that we have totally dark areas here. So this can be solved if I press Shift D and add another light. This can be solved like this. I can add a second light, which then I might dull down a little bit. Something like that. That works quite well. Another way we can solve this is by using an environment light. So this is an alternate technique. Now, for this, actually, the second light here looks quite good. It's got that sort of interior artificial feel that actually a still life has. So this is something that I'll leave you to experiment with. But I want to show you the technique of using an environment light. So an environment light is, if I go into this tab here, which is the World tab, we have this lighting set up here, which usually will just be set to, it's usually set something like this. But instead of having an environment texture here, I think by default, it's usually just set to a color. If you ever see this pink color, what that means is that Blender is looking for usually an external file that it doesn't have. So what we're going to do here is we're going to change the color here to an environment texture, and we're going to open a file. And now an environment texture is kind of a special type of image. If I go here, and I'll put this in the description, this is a website called HDRI Haven. And basically what it is a whole bunch of 360-degree spherical images that are being used as lighting sources in 3D scenes. So if we click on one of these, you'll see that this is what the 3D scene looks like. And if you look in the corner here, if I zoom in, these are actually a Blender default object of the monkey, but it's using this scene as a light source to light the monkey. So sometimes it might be transparent and we'll see reflections from the scene here, and you can see the difference here. Or sometimes it's metallic, and the metallicness often looks, well, more metallic when we can see a sort of a world reflected in it. So what we're going to do is, I've downloaded, and you can download these here too, they're free. You just click on one here and you'll just download your file. And then we can add it into our Blender scene. So I keep them in a folder here, CG textures, in my old Skydomes folder, and I'll just grab one of these HDRI images, and then for you, what you might see when this pops up is you might see something like this. Oh, okay. Yes, here we go. You might see your sort of your image in the background here. And if you don't want to see that, if you just go into the render tab here, there's just this little checkbox here that says transparent. And what that means is that the HDRI image won't appear in your scene, but you can still use it as lighting information. So if we go back here to our scene, what I find kind of convenient, I'll just remove some of my lights again. I'll just turn my HDRI strength to 0 and I'll delete that second light. I can just press X here and delete it. With this single light that I've got here in my scene, it's doing quite a good job at getting that sort of dramatic still life lighting effect, but we've got all these areas of complete darkness. We might, if we have time, we might do some other sessions on different types of blender lights, but this combination is kind of fun. Basically, if I have my HDRI and I turn it up just a little bit, we can get kind of a little bit of that extra light that we wanted on the other objects. I can even have it lower than that, as well as getting some sort of interesting reflections happening on the shiny objects. So that's a sort of a second lighting technique for this exercise, the HDRI lighting, which is controlled in the World tab. So just to recap, what we've done today is we've imported this skull, and here it looks like it's automatically gone into my objects folder. That must just be because I had it selected, but let's say it just went into your collection. What a good idea to do is to start making these folders. You can do that by simply going New Collection by right-clicking here, and you'll get a folder here which you can rename and call whatever you like. I'll just delete that one. Once you've got your folder structure, you can drag folders outside and have them just like you would in any other part of your computer, or you can put them inside just to keep things organized. And as we work, it just gets more and more useful. So I'm going to put my skull inside my objects folder, and this is the coral, so I'm going to rename that coral. And I'm going to close that objects folder, so I've got my objects and I can turn them off, which is cool. And I can turn my books on and off. And then we have the still life box here, which is that box we made in the first class. And then here we've got the table, which is the wooden block object I made. Okay, so that's it for exercise 2. It's a bit of a short one. Let's see how we go with that, and I'll chat to you all in class. Okay, bye-bye.